All right, we're going to get started. Abby, if you could go to the next slide. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We're really happy and excited. We had about 300 folks register for today, so it's a bit of a big group with us right now. We have a little over 100 people on, so we are still going to try to use the chat as much as we can and to interact, and we'll have a couple of opportunities for that as well. But first, we just wanted to introduce both Fourth Economy and Connect the Dots, and Sylvia and myself. And you'll see Abby from our team on here as well, helping with all of the tech needs for us today too. So just a little bit about Fourth Economy. We are an economic development consulting firm, and we do that through the lens of a strategic and equitable and a resilient approach to our work. So we have projects across the country ranging on everything from an economic competitiveness planning and strategy to looking at outdoor and cultural economies, feasibility and impact analysis and studies. We're in the climate change and economic impact analysis and resiliency planning space. We also have been looking a lot at workforce, affordable housing, and childcare recently too. So I wanted to tell a little bit about myself and what brought me here today with Fourth Economy, and then pass it to Sylvia to introduce herself overall too, and learn a little bit more about Connect the Dots. But I'm Sally J. Guzik. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives with Fourth Economy. I've spent the past 20 years of my career in the community engagement space. And really that common thread for me was connecting people to advocate and access resources and opportunities that they deemed most essential and necessary for themselves and communities. So I've done that in the urban forestry space, working for a nonprofit that worked to get free street trees in areas that needed them the most. I've done that for an environmental engineering consulting firm looking at the effects of soil and water contamination and how communities can best prepare themselves. I've worked as a doula providing bilingual services to prenatal labor and postpartum care for parents. And I've led innovation hubs both in Miami and Philadelphia, working to get the startups the resources while also supporting some of those existing brick and mortar spaces in cities like Overtown and Wynwood and in West Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. And currently I've been with Fourth Economy for almost 2 years and leading a portfolio of projects that include everything from economic development and the plan that Sylvia and I most recently did with Atlantic City to looking at technology and innovation, like our partnership with the University of Rhode Island, looking at the blue tech and blue economy. And also in the public health sector, so working with health departments and helping community engagement for health improvement plans overall. So really that common thread has been, how do you get people's voices to the table, and then how do you get them to help through the implementation process? So that's what Sylvia and I are going to talk a little bit more about today, both of our firms' experiences and why we choose to work together. And the goal of today is to really get you all thinking about how do you conduct outreach and engagement in the communities that you're working in, and how does that really impact implementation and consensus building overall. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sylvia García-García to introduce herself and her work with Connect the Dots.
Thank you very much, Sally. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this space today. My name is Sylvia García-García. I'm a social impact strategist and inclusive spaces creator. I currently serve as project manager of community engagement at Connect the Dots. And I'm really glad to be here today and share about the work that we do at Connect the Dots, and especially have like this hands-on moment that we'll be devoting on the second part of the webinar. Let me share a little bit about Connect the Dots and the work that we do. Connect the Dots, it's an impact-driven, fully women-owned firm that specializes in community outreach and engagement. We are focused on connecting diverse voices to decision-making to build innovative, meaningful outreach and engagement methods to elevate community and stakeholder voices in participatory processes. Something that you'll be hearing across all the messages that I share with you today is that we use creative and iterative approach. We incorporate education and intentionally design and interactions to ensure that these processes, the engagement processes, are inclusive, accessible, and representative. And we do all this work because we need to build trust and lasting connections with the communities to inform their own futures. So I really hope that you enjoy this moment with us, and let's get started.
So when we think about why Connect the Dots and Fourth Economy have been working together, and what we've heard from some of our clients and organizations like some of you all, is that sometimes when you're looking to do outreach and engagement, there may be capacity and constraints within the organization. And that really limits the ability to be able to coordinate, plan, and convene community members in a thoughtful way. So if people are kind of absorbing more work, or if there's already constraints or different types of projects going on, sometimes it's helpful to kind of bring in that extra layer of engagement from an outside firm as well. Collaborating with another group or of individuals is sometimes helpful to have that objective perspective. So we've also heard that it's nice to have an outsider opinion at times to understand where some of the blind spots may be in terms of connecting to individuals or groups of people within a community. There's also an opportunity to incorporate some promising practices and lessons learned from other communities, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. But being able to benchmark, whether that's other cities, counties, or states, or within a particular industry, to understand lessons learned of what didn't work in a similar situation and where there could be promising practices. So talking about a little bit about expanding that national network, that may be helpful to you as well. We've also heard that when the public isn't involved in the decision-making process, implementation can be more difficult, if not impossible at times. So Sylvia and I will talk a little bit more about what does that mean of thinking through the outreach and engagement strategy, and why is that sometimes more important than the output itself. And then finally, we've heard that sometimes there's a benefit to selecting or finding a neutral convener within your community to remove some of those participation barriers. So if leadership wants to participate, or if there's power dynamics within an organization, having somebody else come into the space to be able to facilitate some of these conversations could help to remove some of those barriers so that everyone can fully participate as well. We can go to the next slide a little bit too. So I'm going to pass it over to Sylvia, but we're going to talk about four different approaches to how we think that public voices can contribute to some of the change within community engagement. And like Sylvia mentioned, then we'll move on to an exercise where we'll keep the chat moving overall. And I did see a comment on recording of the webinar, and we will have that publicly made available after the webinar overall. So we're going to walk through these 4 examples of understanding how lived experiences really provide essential information, how informing barriers and understanding what challenges actually are in a community need to be addressed, how we really create a grounded understanding of local and cultural context, and then finally talking a little bit more about those opportunities for best practices to share out.
Yeah, amazing. So the idea in this next 4 slides is for us to share some examples of how this looks in real life. So let's get started. Talking about essential information about lived experiences. At Connect the Dots, we recently worked with the BRPC and a mobility choices study. And what we wanted is to learn more about how certain racial and ethnic groups move around their neighborhoods, okay? So it was a mobility choices study. We were really targeting certain groups within certain neighborhoods. And after learning more about like our target audiences, we were able to address like specific needs. And this is the piece that we wanted to emphasize. First, having our message delivered through familiar faces was key for us to achieve like a successful engagement process. How we did that through community partners. So instead of us going directly and talking to these specific groups, we talked to community partners, and they were able to partner with us and deliver the engagement pieces. The setting was similar to a porch evening talk. So it was small groups conversations, commonly known as focus groups, but it was in a familiar setting. It was familiar faces. It was a familiar wording that was used. So it was intentional how we did that. Conversations were conducted both in English and Spanish, not simultaneously, but some conversations were fully in English. Some others were fully in Spanish, depending on the neighborhood we were working in. And no interpreters were included as part of this exercise. There were all native speakers that facilitated the conversation. So it was not only about language access, it was also about cultural accessibility. And also, we provided childcare during these conversations that adults could attend. So this is an example of how we put together all the pieces that are required in order to meet people where they are, in order to fit the needs of the people that we need their input from. And you will see like, well, there's like the interpreter's piece, there's like the childcare piece. Well, it's how do you put together all those little pieces. And at the end, the gathered insights help us understand that neighborhoods' mobility choices vary depending on cultural and economic conditions. So that was possible thanks to all the components described in this example. What about the next one, Sally?
Sure, and I'll keep an eye on the chat too and try to answer those questions as they come in. And we'll give some time for those as well. So the second piece for us is really understanding that the public opinion informs us of what challenges and barriers are that need to be addressed. And sometimes what we've heard is that there's either an assumption or a bias of that kind of all of those things are already readily understood because the leadership has an understanding of what the current economic landscape is or what the needs of their overall community, city, state, or area is. But what we found is that it's really important to diversify that. So, kind of building off of the first piece of hearing from lived experiences is understanding that, it's also residents, it's business owners, it's the grassroots organizers and those direct service providers that have an in real time understanding of the needs of the community. So kind of twofold for barriers and challenges. One is to understand that just because you have an immediate understanding or layer of leadership's understanding doesn't mean that you still don't need to dig a little bit deeper to understand like where there direct cultural nuances or pockets of need or services that might need to differ in either the approach or the need overall. And then the second piece to that is actually removing some of those commonly known barriers to participation in real time. So some of the things that Sylvia had mentioned and considerations that we think about for convening are making sure that places that you're choosing are easily accessible via public transit, that you can also offer those one-on-one conversations. So sometimes we'll call them office hours or focus groups, or just set up shop somewhere at an event so that we are meeting people where they are, but there's also less pressure for it to feel like a formalized event that someone has to show up for. We've also leveraged the use of technology since the pandemic and have been hosting events on different days and at different times. So having like a morning, an afternoon, and an evening session. We've heard kind of both sides that online events can be beneficial to removing some participation barriers, especially for those that are child or elder caregivers or that have a different work schedule or difficulty with transportation needs. But we've also heard that, sometimes the in-person events are just as important. So understanding when to use one or both is really important. And as Sylvia mentioned, anything else that can help remove barriers to participation, like childcare, stipends for participation, whether that's for individuals or organizations, and then translation services, especially if it's a community that has other languages that are being spoken. And kind of what we'll build on off of this is our approach to both outreach engagement isn't that it's just this is a one event thing that you host and then you've collected information and it's over. It's really about bringing people along through the process. So how are you communicating what the purpose is of the engagement, and how especially are you communicating what's the follow-up or the next step so people understand where they can still continue to be a part of the process. I did see a question come through asking, do we think it's best to avoid engagement sessions in which translation is required, to keep, for example, sessions in all Spanish, all English? I'll pass it to Sylvia to answer, then I can build on that if you'd like to, Sylvia.
Yeah, I think that as for most questions, this is like, it depends kind of answer. It depends on what the intention of the conversation is. It depends on the layers of engagement or alternative ways of engagement that are available for the public. In the example that I shared on the previous slide, we were targeting like really specific communities in really specific neighborhoods. So we really wanted to go deep, you know. The intention of that engagement tool was to go deep, to go into the details, to go into the at what time, when, why, how. So for those conversations, it didn't make sense to have an interpreter. It was better to have like native speakers facilitating the sessions. In other cases, we do use interpreters because it's maybe like a quicker interaction. It's just about like outreach. We'll talk more about the difference between outreach and engagement. So it depends. It depends on the intention. It depends on the moment. It depends on the desired insights that it's required. So we will learn more about this in the next couple of, in the second part of the webinar. Yeah.
And I think if we go to the next slide, the next example that Sylvia is going to talk about more also answers another question that came up, which was how have individuals with this different types of abilities been accommodated overall? So I think this is a great example to maybe build off of that too.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's talk about grounded understanding of local and cultural context. I will address the abilities piece in a moment. So at Connect the Dots, we also work with the City of Philadelphia on a meaningful placemaking project for a building known as a Roundhouse. For those based in Philly, you know what I'm talking about. So we tailor an engagement techniques to better engage the Chinatown community, which is a neighbor of the project site. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, we had an engagement strategy, but then we tailor specifically for this community. It means a couple of things, including, but not limited to, our staff always included people who were representative of the audiences that we were engaging with. Similar to the familiar faces piece of the previous example, in here, it was not necessarily familiar faces. Sometimes it was, but the component that we made sure to include was like people, like our staff being representative of the audiences that we were trying to engage with. These staff members serve also as interpreters during all engagement events. And the highlight here is that one-on-one and semi-private conversations and survey applications were available during the engagement events. These events used to be like crowded, like in really public spaces where a lot of people attend. There's like sometimes music in the background, there's passerbys, you know, like there's a lot of noise and movement around this kind of events. And we try to create for this specific community, like these one-on-one opportunities, sometimes semi-private. It could be like, as you're looking in the photo right now, just like a little space on the side of the huge setting. Sometimes we were able to offer like a full table with a couple of chairs there. But the idea is to really use what we know of our target audiences and tailor a space to reach them. And when talking about like people with different abilities, including different age ranges, for example, and in this same project, we use a lot of art-based engagement. So instead of people answering a survey or instead of people, I don't know, attending a public meeting, you know, like the traditional formats of engagement, we use art-based, a mural. We use a lantern activity where people can draw on lanterns, where people can draw, can paint. So that's how we meet people where they are, and we include them not only in terms of language access or certain abilities. It's more like again, like different layers, like all the components that we put together to make it accessible and to make it respectful of everyone's resources.
And kind of building off of that, and if we go to the final example before we head into the work, the collaborative worksheet that we'll do together, I think to answer another question related to the differing abilities, Sylvia had done some user experience engagement as well with individuals that had physical disabilities that were looking to also use like outdoor recreation resources. So like meeting with those specific individuals and having a conversation on how they would ideally use a public space and what the benefit would be to them and what are the considerations for building out the infrastructure and or the communication outreach is kind of one example of that. I think there's other considerations depending on your community. We've found that communities that have a loss of industry and or a loss of workforce, an opportunity that's led to perhaps a higher rate of poverty or a level of concern within the community where there isn't access to resources. We've seen that there's a higher level of adverse childhood experiences, which the CDC measures ACEs as a level to understand like what's the relative trauma related to an area. So there are different types of certifications and courses that individuals can take that are somewhat nominal when you're thinking through trauma-informed care approach and training, especially when you're working with individuals that may have had repeated types of activities happen to them, whether or not they've ever been a part of a planning process or they felt that development or change has happened to them instead of that being a collaborative process. So that's another consideration. So thinking through, you know, the physical abilities, the cognitive abilities, you know, are there other underlying challenges that a community has, whether that's trauma or whether that's a higher rate of substance use disorder. Those are other things to think about. And I think building off of some of the questions around translation and language is that if you know that there's a representation within your community for a particular group that you want to engage, like making those accommodations are essential. So to Sylvia's point, it may not be feasible to always hire a native speaker for a facilitator, but it may be essential to also always have your materials that you're communicating to the public be translated. So discerning between, you know, when you need to bring someone in to engage, when you can have something directly translated, and when you can kind of house some of those interests or opportunities in-house versus when you have to engage with another partner, or all things that you may need to consider. So finally, wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, where we see engagement to also, if we go back to the last slide, where we see engagement being a benefit for promising practices. What we've learned is, especially, you know, throughout the pandemic, people are a lot more willing to meet online for a virtual coffee or tea. And for that, that's meant for us building a broader network of both like-minded organizations or bodies of work or interests that folks are working on where you can really learn. So, you know, we've started to see that momentum building a lot with our outdoor recreation and cultural economy work. Knowing that, you know, in this picture, we're working with the Blue Ridge Music Center, and they wanted a better understanding of other communities that they could perhaps benchmark against that have maybe a similar entry point to a music center and a similar demographic of folks showing up for events and listening to bluegrass music or other types of music. So for us, it was really important to kind of identify some of those other areas to consider. We've done that for outdoor economy practices as well. And we found that the benefit to thinking about engagement, not just locally, but as a broader network, is so that you can learn from communities that may have done something and it didn't work out with similar resources or similar variables for consideration. Or alternatively, they may have an approach that really worked out for them and that you can learn from. And we found more often than not that those sorts of communities are really interested in looking to help one another. So, you know, some of the work that we've done, we've helped organizations build capacity for, is identifying who those partners can be and who they can kind of build a relationship with for more of a long-term approach to engagement and outreach over time, so that you can look a little bit outside of your community for some other best practices and build those relationships too. I'm going to pass it back to Sylvia, and I'm going to keep an eye on some of the questions coming through in the chat as well.
Yeah, we have a lot of great questions in the chat. So you can help me with the next slide. Before we move on with the rest of the webinar content, and just to wrap up, because you've been listening to Sally and me talk about outreach and engagement, some of you could be like confused or not really clear on what does it mean. Let's set a common ground about basic terminology. We think about about outreach as a one-way communication. It's where we invite people to participate, a call to action. We let people know what's happening and invite them to participate, okay? On the other side, we think about engagement as a two-way communication. We ask and we hear back. It's a process centered on information gathering that later informs a process, to decision-making process, okay? So think about outreach. Let's talk about, we mentioned focus groups, right? During our examples. So imagine that we're having a focus group tomorrow. So outreach is all these efforts that we do in order to invite people to join us, okay? To confirm that they are attending. If we're having estimates, like, like letting them know that they're like a compensation, letting them know when, where, how, etc. And then the engagement piece is the conversation per se, the focus group per se. We ask certain questions, we receive answers, okay? That's a simplified example, but it happens with art-based engagement, for example. Outreach is letting know people where a mural will be and they can contribute. The engagement piece will be we asking them a question, the public, and the public responding through, I don't know, some drawing or something else, like an activity. It could be anything. Okay, so let's move forward and talk really briefly about engagement with communities and stakeholders. There are like multiple ways of doing this, okay? We can do outreach and engagement in so many different ways. At Connect the Dots, we'll lead with the values of that guide our work, and these are the values, okay? These are like the principles that guide us. When we talk about impact-driven participation, we think about connecting engagement interactions to key decision points. Where is the public input required? That's where we connect dots, that's where we identify what it's really required to learn from the public. And instead of asking like 7 questions, maybe we need to simplify and just ask 2, okay? It's not about asking less, it's about being smart on what we ask, okay? And this is linked to people first. We respect community members, focusing on building trust through accountability. Community members and stakeholders are the experts in their own life, and we treat them accordingly, okay? When we talk about inclusive processes, of course, I am sure that you both are thinking about like ADA accessible buildings and language access. Of course, we think about that, but we think beyond that. We create access to opportunities for input to ensure like community representation with special consideration of marginalized voices. In community engagement, there's like no one size fits all. And we know that individual and collective identities are made up of multiple layers. So are our engagement strategies, okay? We talked across our examples that we usually don't have only one tactic that we're using to engage people. There are like multiple layers of that. It's like different versions of the same tactic, different tactics, different formats, in person, remote, and so on. It's about creating like a really inclusive process. That's why we prioritize creative solutions. We design approachable, memorable interactions tailored for the community context, so we can meet people where they are. Public meetings and surveys, of course, are an option among dozens. Okay, we work motivated by creating experiences that are friendly, significant, and welcoming for the public. And last but not least, transparent. We provide clear, accessible information, giving participants insights and involvement in the process itself, and circling back to show outcomes, okay? Having a share back session at the end of the process, that's being transparent. Having a project hub or a share folder or someone like a phone number that they can reach out to know what's going on, that's transparency. Okay, so we know that there's a lot of questions in the chat, but we'll get to there in a minute.
So before we're going to turn over into the exercise, and here's some final considerations when we get started. We like to think about the people, the places, the partners, and as Sylvia mentioned, the layers of engagement. So for us, when you're thinking about going through this worksheet that we'll reshare the link for, you're going to be thinking about some of those cultural nuances that we've talked about, the language and translation services, the accessibility accommodations, but some of the other pieces to remove participation barriers and to build trust. You're going to think about the places in which you convene people. So leveraging community centers, places accessible by public transportation, and more importantly, some place that's supportive and welcoming an environment. Additionally, doing that on an online space is also totally possible. So curating that welcoming and collaborative space with the right tools and technologies, whether that's video conferencing and some sort of whiteboard tool or technology as well. And then part of that outreach piece is identifying who are those other trusted community groups that provide direct services, that are grassroots organizations and champions, and that can be used as communication channels to get out some of the information. And for us, that all speaks to the different types of layers of engagement. So again, we're not looking at this as like a one-time event of coordinating with the public, but rather pieces of engagement that happen throughout the process of gathering information, making considerations or developing a plan of action, and then getting folks into the implementation space overall. So for us, that can include, like Sylvia mentioned, online surveys, paper surveys, in-person sessions, leveraging arts or special events, meeting people where they are as much as possible, and leveraging that creativity wherever possible as well. And I did see some questions come through, but we're going to get a chance to answer those in just a moment once we get started. So I'm going to pass it to Sylvia to get us started on the exercise that we'll work on together.
Amazing. Okay, so I hope everyone is joining from a laptop. If you're joining from your phone, let's try to keep an eye on the screen. Okay, so it's time to get all hands on. In the chat, you will find a worksheet. It's a Drive link. It will be posted in the chat soon. It's also in the last email reminder that you received. There's a Drive link in there, okay? So let us know if you have access to the worksheet. Okay, amazing, it's there. So if you have a printed version, that's perfectly fine. Just make sure that you have a pencil, pen, something to write on, okay? So while you make sure to have access to this file, we will start moving forward with the instructions, okay? There are 2 pages, page A and B, really simple. Let's focus on page A first, okay? So it's, you've been receiving like a lot of information plus all the questions that you either posted on the chat or you're still thinking about it, okay? So let's take literally a minute, okay, to recall and reflect. Let's take a deep breath and reflect on what you have just learned and heard and learned during this conversation so far. Start typing, writing down your top of mind thoughts, okay? Let's take a minute to do so.
And you don't need edit access. You would actually have to make a copy of that document yourself. So feel free to kind of copy and paste it or to just duplicate that document. It also should have showed up as a link in your Zoom invite via email too. I'm going to answer a couple of the Q&A questions while folks are getting started, but feel free to add into the chat too. So going to the Q&A box first, and then I'll go back through the chat. There was a question around what are the logistics of how we've offered office hours in the past? Do you set a specific time for people to come in? Is it an open door policy? Do you hold space at offices or somewhere in the community? How many of these do you host over a project? And the answer to that really depends on the project overall. But for example, we found that when we're pulling community input for a particular project or process, whether that's an economic development strategy or an organization strategy, picking somewhere like a city hall or a library or a local university or someplace that's open to the public where they can be comfortable accessing the space, where there's limited barriers to transportation, that all works. We've done it in the past where it's just been a specific set of times. So like a 10 to 2, anybody can drop in. We've done it before where people can schedule in advance. So using a doodle poll or asking additional questions. And it kind of could just depend on kind of how many you would want to do. So typically we would run that in tandem with either interviews or other focus groups and use it as an alternate way to convene people. And this second question seems to be for Sylvia. When engaging in art input for engagement, do you make the murals and activities yourself, or do you partner with local artists and public art agencies?
Yeah, glad to comment on this one. We generally partner with organizations that specialize in art-based engagement. Yeah, it's really helpful to have like experts on literally not only the concept, but also the tools. So yeah, we generally partner with these kind of organizations. It's really helpful when engaging, as I said before, with people with different skills, with different abilities and different age ranges. And also when you're talking about sensitive topics, it's like a safe space just to have a, I don't know, like a page to draw on or a mural where your contribution will be anonymous. It's really liberating. It could be also through poetry. We've done that. So yeah, it could take so many different ways. But yeah, we usually partner with the experts. Amazing. So I hope everyone had the time to really work and reflect on what you have learned so far. And from now on, I will ask you to please consider a project that you're working on. It could be at work, or it could be a project you're volunteering at, and that will benefit from community engagement, okay? Think about a decision-making process that will benefit from the public's voice, okay? Let's take a minute to think about it. Is it clear for you maybe? It could be work-related, it could be non-work related. Okay, everyone with that idea in mind? Okay, so let's move to subsection 2 in page A, okay? Is the first, well, the second column in there. So let's think about how public voices will be connected to the decision-making process, okay? What do you aspire to learn from the public? That's the main question. What do you aspire to learn from them? And how and where can the public provide insights and information? Okay, this is a huge question. For this exercise, let's try to identify only 2 or 3 maybe key desired insights, okay? Imagine that it's a, I don't know, park renovation or a redevelopment in a building, or it's a, I don't know, a playground that is being renewed in a school, okay? Choose your example. Let's first think about when the public input is required, like at the beginning, before everything happens, during the change happens, or after in some way, okay? Or it could be before, during, and after, okay? Once you identify when, let's think about what do you aspire to learn from the public? What are you thinking about incorporating public voices into this decision-making process, okay? Let's try to identify the desired insights in terms of questions, okay? What do you wanna learn, okay? So let's take 3 minutes to work on this, and 2 questions are good, okay? 2 questions, because are like really robust, huge questions, okay? 3 minutes for this one.
While folks are working on the A2 desired insights part of the worksheet, I'm going to go back through and answer a few more of the questions. There was a question related to, how many people should be engaged on average versus how many would the team like to engage? And if that's a great question, I think folks, there's a little bit of another question that's tied to that. I think at the end of balancing a budget and reaching a large audience, like what do we find is better, one large event with heavy advertising or as many small events with less advertising? I think for both of those is to understanding like what's the goal of the outreach and engagement overall. Is it for the public to have transparency and understanding in the decision-making process? Is it to collect and solicit information from a particular group of people to really influence the decision-making process of an initiative that you're trying to work out? And so what we found is it is helpful to set a goal. So whether that's, we find that community group sessions, having smaller groups of about 8 to 10 people at a table is probably the most that you would want to have at a table where you're really trying to dig deep into some of those conversations that Sylvia mentioned. That if you have a really large group of people show up to an event, like 200 people, that might not be the best way to go deep with the information, but it might be a really good opportunity to kind of share an update to get a general sense of transparency created with the process that you would be undertaking. But you might not be able to collect all of that individual feedback. The big events, though, however, could be leveraged to use to sign up for smaller focus groups and to promote those smaller events, to sign up for one-on-one interviews. It could be a great opportunity to conduct a survey depending on what type of information you're looking to collect. So kind of going back to that question of how many people, it should be like setting a goal and understanding what does that mean if you're looking to have 25 versus 100 people. What do you do? Also setting expectations if you don't get that participation, either in the outreach or in the engagement. Where are you willing to realign expectations, and where are you willing to try again to have a better outcome? And then understanding based on your budget, will a big event be better for just kind of getting that information out, or will the time be better spent on having smaller, more deeper conversations with individuals that would be a part of the long-term implementation process? I don't know if you want to build on that before we go to the comment about political viewpoints as well, Sylvia.
No, I think it was pretty straightforward. We usually think about depth versus breadth. It's about choosing if you need like all the details and a really deep conversation, or you're just in need of spreading the word. So it's about that. So thank you. Let's keep a pause on comments for now, and hopefully everyone is doing great with their desired insights, okay? I hope that everyone has at least 2 questions that you wanna learn from the public, okay? Linked to the decision-making process. So let's think about in the same page A, okay? Let's move to the last section, target audiences, okay? Our communities or stakeholders, what are they like? What are their motivations? What are their identities? What are their interests? And what is key to understanding them, okay? And everything that you know about your target audiences, let's put it in there, okay? And you will craft 2, maybe 3, if you have enough time. Let's craft 2 audiences, okay? The most you know about your audience, the better, okay? And we will understand more about why in the next page, okay? So let's focus on choosing 2, maybe 3 audiences, and let's try to put there what I know about them, okay? It could be demographics like age, racial and ethnic background, language spoken, income level, okay, all those pieces, but also what else do I know about them? Do they have like a 9-to-5 job? Do they, I don't know, ride bike? Do they, depending on the topic that matters to you, okay? Let's put there 2 audiences and what you know about them, okay? Let's take 3 minutes for this.
We'll go back to 2 of the comments and questions in the chat while folks are filling out that section A3 in the worksheet. There was a question around, would love to hear about political viewpoint as a consider of engagement. We're learning in West Virginia that engagement in environmental topics largely depends on the language with which topics are presented. This is a great comment and something that we see come up very frequently, because when you're talking about the economic landscape of an area, there's many differing opinions, and then to Heather's point, different types of language that's used to position some of those sentiments as well. So we found, and I think this relates to another comment as well, of like those loud voices that show up to the meeting that sometimes drown out some of the other small voices. We found that developing a set of ground rules or guidelines for conversations and engagement is really helpful. So we usually get the advisory or steering committee to buy into those, of the process in which we would be engaging. This also answers another question that's in the Q&A, which is like, how do you define that audience, and kind of what we've set as a expectation with the client. But if you're doing the engagement work internally, what you can do is say, like, we're looking to identify these audiences, like Sylvia is having you do with this exercise right now. And then you're starting to tie, like, what are the resources or opportunities that would be needed to engage with those audiences. You're going to also try to come to some sort of agreement that if you don't identify those marginalized community members that can be champions, or that can lead sessions or be a part of the engagement process, like, what are you going to do as that effort? So sometimes what we've seen come up is a real want on the community side to diversify their outreach and engagement, but sometimes, whether that's due to capacity constraints or the network in and of itself, we've had to step in and say, hey, it looks like we're missing X, Y, and Z groups of people over here. Here's some recommended strategies that we think would be helpful to get those folks involved. Or it looks like we haven't interviewed any women yet, or we haven't engaged with the youth, or we haven't had the perspective of somebody that's over the age of 65 that's aging in place. So those are the types of questions that you'll want to develop, or like, you know, if we miss the mark, what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to revisit it to make sure that we can address it? And then for the political piece of it and the kind of the loud voices, I think that set of ground rules can be really helpful for saying, like, what is the common piece of information that we're all coming together and can agree upon. So we're all looking for more quality jobs in this region, and that's where we're going to start the conversation. And we're going to start with the understanding of X, Y, and Z to make sure that we're all coming from a similar position with the language. It's not easy, and it's sometimes difficult. And, you know, we think about those strategies where, if it is a really loud voice, sometimes we have a one-on-one interview with that person to get their perspective and that sort of a setting. And then we also can use that as an opportunity to right set kind of what we expect for them engaging with a larger group of people. Like, hey, we know that you're really passionate and involved in this, but we also want to collect information from other folks that are showing up. So let's have this conversation now. And we ask that when you show up to the public events, that you can participate or lead in this sort of a way. So kind of repurposing their interest or passion in a way that can be helpful to the group too.
Yeah. Okay, amazing. Let's go back. Thank you, Sally, for helping us catch up with chat comments. Let's go back to our worksheet, okay? So we should be done with page 8, right? It's getting more and more interesting, right? So let's scroll down or flip your printed version of the worksheet, and let's focus on page B, okay? We will integrate our desired insights on our audiences on one matrix, okay? So in one axis, you will have audiences, and the other you will have desired insights, okay? And here's when the creative piece comes to scene, okay? Once we have the first row and the first column filled with what you work on page A, okay, we will start thinking about what strategies make sense to reach different audiences, okay? And this is related to the last question that we received in the Q&A section. What different layers can you employ to reach your audiences and gather different insights, okay? So here's an example. Imagine that you have a foreign-born Philadelphia youth as the target audience, okay? And your desired insight is how they are using parks and open spaces in the neighborhood, okay? You will be thinking about what strategies could you be using to reach them, okay? Maybe partnering with community centers, libraries, community colleges, support groups, etc., where they can find them. Another component of your strategy could be translation or interpretation of materials and content. Another component is that there is maybe a cultural component to be considered while tailoring your engagement strategy. Or does the age range require you to have guardians involved in some capacity? Okay, so these are the questions that you will start asking yourself while tailoring and thinking about which tactics or how to engage and to get your audiences to respond your desired insights. Okay, sorry that I'm moving my hands, but I'm thinking about the table. So it's like the audiences and the desired insights. So let's start thinking how you get your audience based on what you know about them, answer that question, okay? I hope this example is useful, and let's use the next 3 minutes to start drafting your matrix, okay?
And while we get close to wrapping up, if there's any final questions or comments, feel free to add them into the chat or the Q&A, or if this is sparking an idea, or alternatively, if there's been questions that have come up that you have an answer or a recommendation to that you'd like to share that's worked for you, we'd love to hear that as well.
Let's think about this matrix being the backbone of our engagement strategy, okay?
Sylvia, going back to some of these questions, curious for your perspective, especially on the differing of political viewpoints and kind of how you've navigated that through some of your activities.
Yeah, well, I think a great example was the project that we worked on last year. Usually it depends again. Sometimes what we do, it's try to avoid like, for example, election weeks, because people in the communities are really like overwhelmed with what's going on, just to be respectful of their time, their brain space and so on. Usually we avoid doing engagement activities during that week. And in terms of like the more general non-election related political side of things, I mean, it depends. It depends on the project. Sometimes our clients are like local governments, okay? So they do bring their own, some guidelines on how to move forward. Sometimes it's not a government who's involved in any capacity, but we know that some communities are more sensitive or more involved into what's going on in a local level. So it depends. Yeah. For example, this year in Philly, it's not only 1 month or 1 week that we need to consider, but the whole year, right? Because the conversation is live from now till end of the year. So yeah, it really depends on where you're standing, the topic of the discussion. It would be different if we're talking about like a comprehensive plan or something like huge scale, that if you're talking about one rec center, you know, like the implications are different, or one park. So yeah.
And we found with some of those really complex situations, sometimes it is possible to kind of agree where you are disagreeing and kind of set that as the ground rules and where the position. And sometimes like that isn't possible. And when it's not, it's that individualized approach to engagement, whether it's like codifying groups of folks to get that feedback and that's unfiltered and transparent from them and kind of relating it back to the bigger picture. Yeah,
and again, I think it's a great example to what we said before about like the community members and the stakeholders are experts in their context, you know, like go to them, reach them and ask them, like, how is it going? Like, is anyone talking about it? No, okay, no problem at all. Oh, everyone's talking about X, Y, or Z, then you need to pay attention to it. Okay, so everyone, how are we doing? Do we all have our tactics matrix ready? Okay, we have no questions in the chat, so we're assuming everything is extremely clear and you're ready to move forward. Congratulations on getting this ready, because this is the backbone of your engagement strategy. Okay, what's next? If you're interested in implementing your engagement strategy and connecting public voices to your decision-making process, here you have your first draft. Okay, so we really expect that it's a useful exercise. And I don't know, maybe we can move on to the last slide, Sally.
Yeah, just wanted to leave a moment for any final comments in the chat. But Sylvia and I are really open to catching up with you, floating an idea our way or talking through something that you're working on. So wanted to leave with our email addresses as well. So feel free to reach out. This has been a great conversation. We've had a really big audience for this, and we also recognize the opportunity to have a smaller conversation with some folks as well. So we'll be reaching back out to you all in the coming weeks to see about a follow-up conversation where we can talk real time some of the issues and challenges and or opportunities that you're working with as well.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Congratulations again, you did a great job. We really hope that you can use what you work on this noon. And please feel free to reach out. We'll be happy to have a conversation and I don't know, work together, learn from each other, and we'll be happy also to hear your best practices, because again, you're the experts in your own communities. So have a great rest of your day.